So it's kind of a crazy question, but which is worse, sugar or wheat? Well, the first thing to understand is that wheat and other grains have a carbohydrate, what I call a supercarbohydrate, called amylopectin A. And amylopectin A is very digestible in the human gastrointestinal tract because we have an enzyme called amylase, both in our saliva as well as in the stomach, and it's extremely efficient at digesting amylopectin A into glucose, into sugar. And so anything made of grains or wheat raises blood sugar very quickly to very high levels. Well, sugar does likewise. The amylopectin A is actually slightly worse than table sugar, sucrose, but they're both pretty bad. So what happens when either sucrose, sugar, or the amylopectin A of wheat and grains has these effects? What does it do? Well, when you raise blood sugar, blood insulin also has to go up. And that's the process that, if repeated over and over and over again, causes insulin resistance. And that's the root cause of so many health conditions like prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and even conditions like dementia. So that process of high blood sugar from either sucrose or from amylopectin A leads to insulin resistance and all the associated problems. Eating sucrose or the amylopectin A of grains both lead to fatty liver. And the reason for that is the liver engages in a process called de novo lipogenesis. And all that means is the liver is very good at taking carbohydrates, whether it's sucrose or the glucose and fructose of sucrose or the amylopectin A of grains, and converting it to triglycerides. And some of those triglycerides get into the bloodstream, so people tend to have higher triglycerides when they eat sugar and grains. But some of those triglycerides never make it out of the liver, and they accumulate there, and that's what causes fatty liver. It's not fat that causes it. It's de novo lipogenesis, the conversion of carbohydrates into fat, into triglycerides in the liver. Blood triglycerides go up. What does that do? Well, they don't float around as triglycerides. They usually float around in a particle called very low density lipoproteins, VLDL particles, that are very triglyceride rich. Well, having a lot of VLDL particles in your bloodstream begins a series of reactions in the bloodstream that leads to the formation of small LDL particles. Not LDL cholesterol. That's what I call the kindergarten version of how heart disease is caused. You and I are going to go graduate to the higher level of sophistication. When you have excess VLDL particles, you get an excess of small LDL particles, a very potent cause for heart disease. So sucrose and the amylopectin A of grains, of wheat and grains, are potent contributors to risk for heart disease. Bowel flora. Both sucrose and the amylopectin A change bowel flora. In particular, they invite changes to bacterial species and cause bacteria and fungi like Candida albicans, Candida glabrata, Candida tropicalis, Malassezia, and other species to ascend. Bacteria and fungi should stay mostly in the colon. But when you eat a lot of sugars and grains, it's like putting breadcrumbs out for the ducks. It's like inviting the bacteria and the fungi to ascend. And you have these common conditions called SIBO and SIFO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, which in turn leads to a whole new collection of problems. It could be fibromyalgia, it could be irritable bowel syndrome, it could be restless leg syndrome, it could be a neurodegenerative condition, but it's a long list of health conditions with that process begun by sugar and grain consumption. Both sugar and the amylopectin A of grains accelerate aging. And the reason for that is every time blood glucose rises to high levels, you glycate the proteins of the body. And this is an irreversible process. Endogenous glycation is irreversible. So if I glycate the proteins in the lenses of my eyes, I get opacities or cataracts. If I glycate the cartilage proteins in my knees and hips, I get brittle cartilage that leads to arthritis. If I glycate my skin, it thins and gets age spots. So having high blood glucose, whether it's from sucrose or from amylopectin A of grains, accelerates all the phenomena of aging. Hormonal disruptions, that insulin resistance we talked about, leads over time to the growth and accumulation of visceral fat. That's the fat that encircles the internal abdominal organs and the heart, by the way. But you can see it on the surface. You can see it reflected on the surface as love handles or a muffin top. Well, that visceral fat is very inflammatory, but one of the peculiar properties of visceral fat is that it distorts hormonal behavior. So women will have higher testosterone, often grow excess body hair, become infertile, and are very prone to diabetes. Guys grow breasts, get female-like hips. They have a low testosterone and high estrogen. So when you grow visceral fat from consumption of sucrose or amylopectin A of grains, you introduce hormonal distortions, very peculiar hormonal distortions that are unique to the modern age. Cancer. Cancer cells love anything that has sugar in it. That's why PET scanning is performed by radioactively labeling glucose. That's how, because the radioactive glucose goes right to the cancer and lights it up on a PET scan. So when you consume a lot of sugars, when you consume a lot of grains, you're inviting cancer. It's like throwing cow manure on a garden. You're going to have things grow. So those are the common behaviors, common consequences of sucrose and amylopectin A. Now, with wheat and grains, there's other things beyond these effects. So all those effects I listed from wheat and grains are from the amylopectin A component. But wheat and grains have other things in them, like gliadin. Gliadin is a protein within gluten, and we now know it's the protein that initiates the process of many, if not most, autoimmune diseases, like type 1 diabetes in kids and rheumatoid arthritis. Gliadin has the peculiar capacity to pry apart the barriers between intestinal cells and allows foreign substances through. We now know that is the initiating process in autoimmune diseases. So the gliadin protein of wheat initiates autoimmune diseases. Gliadin is also, upon partial digestion, recall that we can't digest the protein. We can digest the carbohydrate of wheat, but we can't digest the proteins of wheat. Many of them remain undigested or only partially digested. The gliadin protein is broken down to 4 or 5 amino acid long pieces or peptides. And these peptides, these gliadin-derived opioid peptides, bind to the brain, bind to the opiate receptors of the human brain, and have a whole catalog of peculiar effects, such as behavioral outbursts in kids with ADHD and autism, or paranoia in people with schizophrenia, or depression, people prone to depression, suicidal thoughts. But in those of us without those conditions, gliadin-derived opioid peptides stimulate appetite. So the gliadin in wheat and grains is a very potent appetite stimulant. And that's why people who eat wheat are never satisfied. They're always hungry, and they have to eat food all the time. And even with a full stomach, filled to bursting like a bowl of pasta, they're still hungry. There's wheat germ agglutinin. Wheat germ agglutinin is a highly toxic compound in wheat that is very toxic to the intestinal lining. A little bit can get through into the bloodstream, and that little bit is also extremely inflammatory. It also causes blood clotting. That's what its name means. Agglutinin means it agglutinates or clots red blood cells. So wheat germ agglutinin, very inflammatory and very toxic to the intestinal lining. If you give just a milligram to a laboratory rat, its intestinal tract is destroyed. It looks a lot like celiac disease, but it's not an autoimmune process. Phytates. Phytates are compounds in wheat that bind anything that's positively charged. So positively charged minerals such as iron, zinc, manganese, magnesium, copper, and several others. So when you consume grains, wheat and grains, as in a bagel or pancakes or sandwich, you become deficient in these minerals because the phytates bind them and you pass them out in the toilet. So iron deficiency anemia is exceptionally common and often doesn't respond to iron supplements, iron injections, and some people even get blood transfusions before it's determined that it's just due to the wheat germ, to the phytates of wheat and grains. So phytates from wheat cause nutritional deficiencies. There are numerous allergens. There are literally thousands of other proteins in wheat and grains that commonly cause allergic phenomena such as sinus congestion, asthma, gastrointestinal distress, and a variety of other skin rashes, a variety of other effects. And lastly, there's herbicide residues like glyphosate or Roundup in wheat because so much of it is used in generating the wheat plant. So which is worse? Both are bad, right? Sugar and wheat, both pretty bad. But sugar and wheat have a lot in common. And they both raise blood sugar and have all those other effects. But wheat has a whole long list of other effects. So if we were forced to say which one is worse, wheat is worse, even though both are bad. But because wheat has all those additional components, all those additional effects, wheat comes out as the worst one.